In the heart of ancient Rome, freedom was not a universal right. It was a privilege reserved for citizens, while millions lived and died as property. This is the story of those who dared to escape that bondage, and the brutal machinery of punishment that awaited them. The Roman Empire was built on the backs of enslaved people. Conservative estimates suggest that during the height of the empire, between 1/4 and 1/3 of Italy's population lived in slavery. We're talking about millions of human beings, captured in war, born into bondage, or sold to pay debts. They formed the invisible foundation of Roman prosperity, working in households, fields, mines, and workshops across the Mediterranean world. For women in this system, the experience of enslavement carried additional layers of vulnerability. Historical sources indicate that enslaved women worked as domestic servants, weavers, agricultural laborers, and wet nurses. The legal scholar Ulpian, writing in the 3rd century CE, makes clear in the Digest of Roman law that slaves were considered property, not persons. They could be bought, sold, inherited, and disposed of at their owner's discretion. This legal reality shaped every aspect of an enslaved person's existence. The 2nd century writer Gaius explicitly states in his legal textbook, The Institutes, that slaves had no legal standing. They couldn't own property, make contracts, or testify in court except under torture. Their bodies belonged entirely to their masters. Given these conditions, escape was an ever-present possibility and an ever-present concern for slave owners. The frequency of flight from slavery is evidenced by the extensive legal framework Romans developed to deal with it. The jurist, Vivian, also quoted in the Digest, defines a fugitive slave as one who leaves with the intention of not returning. This wasn't a rare occurrence requiring special attention. It was common enough that Roman law developed detailed categories and procedures specifically for handling runaways. When we examine the archaeological and textual evidence, we find that Romans employed multiple strategies to prevent and punish escape. Metal slave collars have been discovered across the former empire, many bearing inscriptions. One famous example, now in the Museo Nazionale Romano, reads, "I have run away. Hold me when you have returned me to my master's owners. You will receive a reward." These collars were physical manifestations of a society's determination to maintain control over human property. The legal codes provide insight into the formal punishments prescribed for captured runaways. The Digest references multiple approaches. First, there was marking or branding. Brands identifying someone as a fugitive served both practical and psychological purposes. They made future escape attempts more difficult by providing instant identification, and they inflicted permanent shame and degradation. Second, there was reassignment to harder labor. The jurist Paul mentions in the Digest that slaves who committed serious offenses, including flight, could be sent to the mills, the mines, or other locations of extreme labor. These assignments were often effectively death sentences, given the brutal conditions. The historical record also references physical punishment, though the specific details are often less explicit than popular imagination suggests. Roman law limited certain forms of punishment by the late Republic period, but enslaved people remained vulnerable to harsh treatment. The agricultural writer Columella, in his 1st century work De Rut Rustica, discusses the management of rural slaves and mentions overseers who were responsible for discipline, including punishment for attempted escape. What made the Roman system particularly effective from the perspective of slave owners was not just the severity of punishment, but its visibility and certainty. Punishment was often public, designed not merely to hurt the individual but to send a message to others. The playwright Plautus, in several of his comedies from the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, makes casual references to slaves being whipped or sent to the mills, suggesting these were familiar enough concepts to Roman audiences that they served as background details in entertainment. The system was reinforced by collaboration among slave owners. Laws required that anyone harboring a fugitive slave could face penalties themselves. Professional slave catchers, mentioned in various legal texts, made pursuing runaways their business. The poet Martial, in his epigrams from the 1st century CE, makes passing reference to the practice of advertising for missing slaves, suggesting this was a recognized part of urban life. For women attempting escape, the dangers were compounded. Beyond the legal punishments awaiting capture, the journey itself presented severe risks. Without legal protection, resources, or often even knowledge of the territory beyond their place of servitude, runaways faced hunger, exposure, and vulnerability to violence. The next part of this examination will look at what the historical sources tell us about the actual implementation of these punishments and what happened to those who were caught. When a runaway slave was captured and returned to their owner, Roman law provided the master with wide latitude in determining punishment. The Digest makes clear that while there were some limitations on the arbitrary killing of slaves by the imperial period, owners retained substantial authority over discipline. The archaeological evidence provides concrete examples of what this meant in practice. The metal collars previously mentioned represent one form of control, but excavations of Roman work sites reveal more. At the Rio Tinto mines in Spain, where slaves labored extracting copper and silver, archaeologists have found evidence of restraints, cramped living quarters, and skeletal remains showing signs of extreme physical stress and malnutrition. While not all of these individuals were necessarily runaways, historical sources confirm that mines served as punishment destinations for enslaved people who had committed offenses including flight. The 1st century agricultural writer Columella provides specific advice on managing rural slaves who might be inclined to run. He recommends housing them in secure quarters, keeping them under constant supervision, and ensuring that those considered flight risks were shackled at night. This wasn't presented as exceptional cruelty, but as standard agricultural management, revealing how normalized these practices were. Branding and tattooing appear repeatedly in the historical record. The Emperor Constantine, in a law from 316 CE, preserved in the Theodosian Code, actually prohibited branding slaves on the face, arguing it defaced the divine image. However, this law explicitly permitted branding on the hands or legs instead, confirming that the practice itself was accepted and widespread. The legal scholar Callistratus, quoted in the Digest, mentions that slaves who repeatedly attempted escape could be consigned to specific penal environments. The mills, particularly grain mills that required constant manual labor turning heavy stones, appear frequently as punishment destinations. The poet Juvenal, in his satires from the early 2nd century, uses the image of slaves working mills as shorthand for the most degraded form of existence. What's particularly important for modern understanding is recognizing that these punishments weren't aberrations or extreme cases. They were part of the normal functioning of Roman society. The casual way Columella discusses management of slave labor, or Plautus jokes about slaves being beaten, indicates that this violence was thoroughly integrated into daily life. For women specifically, the sources provide less detailed information than we might wish. But what exists suggests their experiences followed these general patterns with additional vulnerabilities. The legal texts don't differentiate punishment for male and female runaways in formal terms, though women faced risks of sexual exploitation both during flight and after capture that male slaves didn't experience in the same way. The psychological dimension of these punishments extended beyond the immediate physical pain. Being branded marked someone permanently as untrustworthy, likely resulting in harsher treatment for the remainder of their enslaved life. Being sent to mines or mills was often a slow death sentence, given the brutal conditions. Even those who received lesser punishments lived with the knowledge that another attempt could result in worse. It's worth noting that despite these severe consequences, people continued to attempt escape. This speaks to both the unbearable conditions of slavery and the enduring human desire for freedom. The fact that Roman law devoted so much attention to the problem of fugitive slaves suggests it remained a persistent issue throughout the empire's history. Modern scholarship on Roman slavery emphasizes that we must understand these practices in their historical context while not minimizing their brutality. Historians like Keith Bradley and Sandra Joshua have examined how the Roman system dehumanized enslaved people, reducing them to instruments of production. The punishment regime for runaways was designed not just to recover property, but to maintain the entire social order that depended on slavery. The legacy of Roman slavery influenced later European legal systems and attitudes. Many of the mechanisms for controlling enslaved populations were adapted and employed in different forms through subsequent centuries. Today, we look back on these practices with appropriate moral condemnation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly prohibits slavery and servitude. Yet understanding this history remains important. It reveals the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. It shows how legal systems can codify oppression, and it reminds us that the freedoms we often take for granted were, for most of human history, denied to vast numbers of people. The women and men who attempted escape from Roman slavery left few records in their own words. We know them primarily through the laws written to control them and the casual mentions in texts written by free Romans, but their desperate bids for freedom, documented in legal codes and owner complaints, testify to something the Roman system could never fully extinguish: the fundamental human drive toward liberty. Their stories, fragmentary as they are, deserve to be remembered and told.